ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. We have a very special holiday treat, someone that I have been hoping to get on this show for a very long time and looking forward to, a important leader, especially in times like this, a man I've been honored to know and work alongside of, and now the author of the now best-selling new book, Conflict. The great and powerful General David Petraeus finally joins us on Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Good to be with you, Paul. Thanks.
It's great to finally have you here. We've worked together on many issues. We've served alongside each other on the IAVA board. You've been a great teacher and mentor to me and many others. Let me ask you a question I ask of everybody to start, sir. Where are you and how are you?
I'm doing great. Just back from a 2-week trip that literally went all the way around the world. Started out in the UAE and then eventually went to Southeast Asia and came home via San Francisco. In Arlington, Virginia, in our house for a couple of days, and then get back on the road again quickly before we shut down for the Christmas break.
Is it a break of any kind for the holidays for you, sir? You spent so many years
Absolutely.
overseas in
You
uniform
bet.
and in
No,
conflict.
whole family's gonna gather together. We're gonna head down to the Caribbean and have a great time. Grandkids,
Ex-
kids, and all the rest of that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know it'll be in contrast to what you've been seeing and doing, especially over this last year or so. Can I ask you to start with an overall, landscape analysis? You've been out on the road, you've been
Sure.
talking to a lot of folks in media, but as we head, a week away from Christmas, it feels like conflict, to use your book title, is our new normal. But can you give us an overall global assessment of where you think our world is going into this holiday season?
Yeah, conflict, and I guess unfortunately is all too tragically timely right now. I think to set the global context, I would observe that the US and our allies and partners around the world face a greater number of challenges and more complex challenges than at any time since the end of World War II. If you think about the US as the guy in the circus who gets a plate spinning and then another one and another one, and pretty soon you have a whole tent full of plates spinning. And we have allies and partners that help us keep various of these plates spinning, but the plates representing the challenges, the threats, the issues with which we have to deal. I think you have the largest number of plates, and again, plates that represent the most complex issues uh, since the end of World War II. There obviously is an enormous China plate. It's the most important relationship in the world. We can't let it wobble. There is still a North Korea plate. There is an Iran nuclear program plate. There's also an Iran support to Shia militia plate. There's an Iran drone and missile threat plate. There are individual plates representing specific Islamist extremist organizations on which we still need to keep an eye and pressure. The Russia plate obviously has gotten much more worrisome over the past 2 years with the new invasion of Ukraine early last year. There are other challenges out there, whether they're cyber threats that have manifested themselves from all kinds of different actors or nation states or criminal entities. There are non-state actors, including extremists and others. There are challenges that emanate from climate change, more extreme weather events, and so forth. So again, you look at this tent in which all of these different plates are spinning, and it gives you a bit of pause, noting that, again, the challenges are very, very substantial. And the U.S., in my view, has a unique responsibility to help keep those plates spinning, again, together with partners and allies. But we do it for a very simple reason. This is not for charity. This is because it's in our national security interest and in our economic interest. This is about our security and our prosperity. And that's why we do what we do. And I think we need to do that. We are the indispensable leader nation in that regard.
Sir, do you feel like the world can count on us to be that right now? You talk a lot about the need for strategic leadership, and I want to get a little deeper on that in the questions to come. But right now, it feels like those polls holding up the plates are pretty wobbly. Our Congress is divided. Zelensky just left with nothing. Israel has now become a very divisive issue in this country. Biden is unpopular. When you travel the world, do you feel like the world can count on us right now, and they feel like they can count on us?
Well, there are concerns about the U.S. There are concerns about what's going on in Washington. I do think eventually that we're going to get bipartisan agreement. We have bipartisan agreement on the need to continue to support Ukraine. The problem is that the structure of the House and the very, very small Republican majority, with some members of that party that are opposed to this, prevent it from even getting to the floor in a specific way. So certainly there are challenges from our domestic political situation, from the degree of partisanship that you see. But we've been through tough times before in this regard, many tough times. We generally have come through it quite well. And frankly, on the economic front, we're doing surprisingly well. We'll see if there's a soft landing or any recession or what happens, but the doomsayers so far have been proven incorrect in their predictions. Inflation has come down in an encouraging manner, and yet the labor market is still very robust. Unemployment is still quite low historically. And again, the country is generally doing quite well in that regard. Yep, there's lots of challenges. Some of them have to do with our domestic political situation and the situation on Capitol Hill in particular. But eventually, I think we're going to have a package that will provide substantial assistance for Ukraine, for Israel, for the southern border with Mexico to improve security there, and likely for Taiwan as well.
Sir, it feels like the case for Ukraine is having to be made over again, especially because of the resistance in Congress. Biden has been vocal and consistent in calling for support for Ukraine. Now may have to make compromises on the border in order to get that. But can you give again your strategic assessment of Ukraine right now? Why it's important to the average American, someone who might not be deep into foreign policy or might not have a military background. In your expertise, why is it important for America right now? And how do you see this winter in Ukraine and this next 6 months or so developing from a military and strategic standpoint?
Well, first of all, again, I think it's important to recall that there is a bipartisan majority, very, very strong in the Senate. In fact, some of the biggest champions for Ukraine are on the minority side, on the Republican side in the Senate. So there's very, very strong support for Ukraine there. That doesn't mean that they're not trying to use the leverage that provides to gain some agreement on some issues having to do with our southern border. And again, that's the way our political system works. There's a bipartisan majority in the House for support for Ukraine. The problem is that the party that has the majority has a very slim majority, and there's a handful of individuals in that party who are against this and question it. And so that makes it difficult. But again, I think we're going to get through this. And there will be a very substantial package for Ukraine, for Israel, for the southern border, and probably for Taiwan in that package as well. Now, so as to why? Because it's in our national security interest to do so. If Russia succeeds in Ukraine, it's not going to stop there. It'll keep on going. The next country might be Moldova, which is not a NATO nation, or it could be Lithuania, which is a NATO nation. Then we would be, together with our NATO allies, embroiled in something far worse. Beyond that, the Ukrainians aren't asking for our men and women in uniform. They are doing the fighting for their country. This is their war of independence. That's how they see it, their war of survival. We've gotten an enormous return on investment. We've provided about $44 billion in security assistance so far to Ukraine over a 2-year period, with a defense budget that in aggregate for 2 years would be somewhere around $1.7, $1.8 trillion. We can afford this easily. And they have destroyed something like 60% of the Russian tank fleet. Now, I should note, Europe has stepped up increasingly. They have now provided more than what we have provided in security assistance, just a bit more in terms of the pledges than we have pledged. They've provided much, much more when it comes to economic, humanitarian, and financial assistance. So again, the Europeans are very much invested in this. We have often asked them to share the burden, and I think that they are doing just that in this case, and that's appropriate. It's much closer to their doorstep than it is to ours, but we are the leader of NATO, as we are the leader of the free world. And again, it's great to see us play that role in this case, especially as our European partners are following suit. And I should just note, Putin set out to make Russia great again. What he's really done is make NATO great again. He's actually, his aggressive actions in Ukraine, a brutal, unprovoked invasion that stems from a twisted, grievance-filled, revanchist and revisionist view of history, has actually led two historically neutral countries to seek to join NATO, Finland and Sweden, which have quite capable military forces, by the way. They were part of the coalition that I was privileged to lead in Afghanistan. So again, this is a very important effort to us and to our NATO allies and to the Western world. Borders cannot be allowed to be redrawn on the basis of orders from the kind of authoritarian dictator that Vladimir Putin is.
So you teach strategic leadership. You and I have had conversations about strategic leadership. You talk about the four pillars of strategic leadership. Can you talk about Zelensky specifically? Because it feels like he got the big idea right. And it feels like he's been masterful in organizing the world in support of Ukraine. Do you see it the same way? How do you evaluate him? And, a scenario, if there wasn't Zelensky, I don't know where we'd be. Maybe there'd be another leader who could step into that hole. But it feels like he uniquely has risen to this moment and demonstrated a kind of strategic leadership we haven't seen too often, at least in my lifetime.
He's been a very impressive strategic leader. He's performed the four tasks of a strategic leader superbly. He's gotten the big ideas right. He's communicated them effectively through the breadth and depth of his country and to all others who have a stake in the outcome of this conflict. He's overseen the implementation of the big ideas very impressively, and he's determined how you need to refine the big ideas and do it again and again. It has not been flawless, but it has been very, very impressive. His first big idea, remember, was I don't want to ride, I want ammunition.
Right.
I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to defend Kyiv to the end, keeping in mind that Putin's overriding objective was to take Kyiv, topple the government, and replace Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. Obviously failed. They lost the battle of Kyiv and many of the other early battles throughout the course of last year. And the Ukrainians were actually able to roll them back, not just in Kyiv, but in Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv province, and then all the forces that Russia had that were east or that were west of the Dnipro River pushed them back across. Unfortunately, the summer offensive did not achieve its objectives. But again, Zelensky has throughout all of this been very, very impressive. He's also been an incredible communicator. He's been described as Churchill with an iPhone. He has had very, very differentiated and impressive messages that resonated with the House of Commons, the Bundestag, our Congress, etc. He's inspired his own people repeatedly, and he's had quite a brilliant example, energy, inspiration when it comes to overseeing the implementation of the big ideas, especially in contrast to Putin, who's seated at the end of a long marble table with the minions way down there where you almost need a microphone to be heard where he is. Zelensky, on the other hand, has been on the front lines. He's been in Bakhmut. He's been in Zaporizhia. He took off his suit and put on an OD uniform, which he's worn ever since, various varieties of those different uniforms. So again, very impressive, but the war's not over. And it has become a stalemate. The Russians, in fact, are back on the offensive right now, taking terrible casualties, but gradually taking modest amounts of ground. And it looks as if they're going to try to continue to do that this winter, as they did last winter, without enormous success, but with great casualties. And Ukraine is going to have to strengthen its own defenses in the face of this offensive, and we desperately need to provide additional assistance to them, as do our European, NATO, and other allied partners.
So as we look at those plates spinning, obviously another big one is Gaza and Israel. It obviously Israel has a right and an obligation to defend themselves. They've communicated that they want to eliminate Hamas, but it feels like Netanyahu isn't having the same kind of strategic leadership success in communicating and maybe even just getting the big idea right. At least to me, it seems like he's communicated that they want to get Hamas, but not communicated what happens after that. How do you see it? How do you see where Gaza and Israel are right now, and specifically Netanyahu's ability or skill in communicating so far, and what's likely to be an even more difficult time ahead?
Well, there are two big ideas that have been very clearly articulated so far. Destruction of Hamas, which I think is appropriate. This is a terrorist army equivalent of the Islamic State. Yes, there's a Palestinian national component. But again, this is not a force that can be dealt with in any other way than capturing or, if necessary, killing them. And then also to topple the Hamas political wing, so to take down the government, if you will, of Gaza. But there do need to be some additional big ideas. The Israeli government's working very, very hard on trying to formulate these. What will govern Gaza after Hamas is gone and after Hamas has been destroyed? What is the lot of the Palestinian people in Gaza going to be? While you're at it, perhaps do a bit more on the situation for the Palestinians in the West Bank after this is all dealt with. And then how do you keep Hamas from reconstituting once they've been destroyed? So these are very significant issues. The Israelis are keenly aware of this. I was just in the Middle East a bit over a week ago at a conference which included a number of former senior Israeli officials, a prime minister, in fact, a former chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, et cetera, and also a former Palestinian prime minister. They're wrestling with that. They know they've got to develop answers to that. The U.S. Is working to try to help them with that. But I fear that it may be necessary for Israel to reoccupy Gaza, something they left, of course, in 2005 for a reason. They don't want to reoccupy. We don't want them to do that. But I'm afraid that that may end up being the only possible outcome, at least for a period of time, until they can help to develop a competent, capable, and trustworthy Palestinian entity that can govern Gaza once again in a way that Hamas did not, and ensuring that Hamas is not able to reconstitute, or you'll have to go through all of this again. This is an extraordinarily difficult battlefield. The context, I think, is more challenging than any urban combat since the end of World War II. Yes, there is Mariupol in Ukraine and some others, Hue during Vietnam and so on. But this is an enemy who doesn't wear a uniform, who uses civilians as human shields, has hundreds of miles of tunnel underground, is holding still well over 100 hostages. At some point is going to start blowing themselves up to take Israelis with them. So a very, very challenging context in which to fight, a very difficult and substantial mission to accomplish. And it still begs the answers to these additional questions. It still requires these additional big ideas. And of course, as you clear and hold, you've got to figure out how you're going to take care of the civilians. You've got to minimize innocent loss of life, which means very precise operations. And again, all of this in that setting could not be more difficult.
Sir, as all this unfolds, we've got the race for president back here in the United States. I know you don't get involved in domestic politics, but you've advised presidents. You've, I'm sure, been asked, or you've at least been on lists for possible presidential candidates. Can I ask you, from a strategic standpoint, whether it's Trump, Biden, or somebody else, in your view, given all these other components, what's the big idea that the next president has to get right?
Well, in foreign policy terms, I think it's to recognize that U.S. leadership in the world is still exceedingly important and that there is no substitute for it, that we exercise that leadership not for charitable reasons, but because it's in our national security and economic interest to do so, that we should and will value allies and partners and nurture those relationships because they're hugely important. Uniquely, the U.S., if you look at some of our adversaries and potential adversaries, you don't see large numbers of allies and partners aligning themselves with them. So that's a unique feature of the United States and our actions in the world. But again, that leadership is important. The world needs to be able to count on it because without it, there is no substitute.
Sir, final question, and I appreciate your time. Many folks are concerned this holiday with the rise of friction in the United States, the lack of political unity, the ongoing conflict around the world, not as a general, but as a grandfather, as someone who's an elder statesman to this country. What's your message if you were commanding forces this holiday for folks that are fearing, this constant state of conflict? What's your holiday message to America, and especially to young people who are looking at this situation and maybe find it daunting?
The message is that we're privileged to live in the greatest country in the world, a country that has had many trials and tribulations over the centuries, some of which included an actual civil war. Others have included domestic unrest of various types. We have challenges right now, without question. Keep them in perspective. Our institutions have held strong over the centuries, and have faith that we are going to get through the current challenges, and there will be future challenges. But also feel very grateful for being in a place to which so many citizens of the rest of the world are trying to get because of the situations in which they find themselves, looking at the opportunities that are here in the United States. And for all of the different issues that are out there, the issues that divide us, issues that are very emotional, issues that are highly partisan and are being played on by different political figures in our system and in our society. For all of that, again, recognize the extraordinary blessings that we enjoy in so many different ways, and the genius of the political system that was developed by our founders, again, for all of the shortcomings that they have as well, and take heart at this Christmas season and give thanks for where it is we're privileged to live and our fellow Americans with whom we are privileged to be neighbors.
Well, we've been privileged to have you on this program. I've been privileged to know you. Thank you for your leadership, your voice, your clarity. I wish you and your family a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and a good rest, because we're going to need you in 2024 and beyond. But General David Petraeus, thank you for joining me and for all you do, sir.
Thanks, Paul, and all best to you and yours.